Start.
So yeah, we have the team here from Walker Erickson. They met with staff earlier this morning of department heads. We had some good conversation about things that certain staff members were looking for in the report. The advisory group was created to hopefully look at other aspects of it. So whether it's from the CDA perspective or the senior perspective or the board perspective. So this morning they kind of went through an overview of the findings and recommendations and had some discussion back and forth. I think that's how we're gonna, structure tonight as well, so, with that, if you wanna take it away and get going.
Yeah, there were a lot of good lessons learned this morning, and this is a working draft. We have a lot of information on the community that's been gathered, a lot of opinions, a lot of good focus group contribution, and town hall contributions that are reflected in the recommendations. And there is still some work to be done over the next couple weeks before we reissue the report. So by no means is this final. And today we're just gonna spend a little bit of time walking through where we are in the project life cycle, the study area, and then we're going to remind everybody of the goals for the transportation and parking planning effort, and then go through our recommendations, and then Steve, and this is Aaron, a colleague here at Erickson, going to talk through some of the traffic and stop sign intersection modifications and other large policy discussion items. As far as life cycle, where we are right now, we're in the analysis and recommendation portion. We've completed the community input. There is one more town hall, but that's to present. We have documented all the information that's been provided to us by online submission, as well as individual phone calls, meetings, focus group meetings and town halls. We put together preliminary recommendations and the analysis, but now there's a critical piece. It's getting information, feedback from TAG, getting information and feedback from the staff. And the staff provided some perspective from the implementation standpoint. If a policy is implemented, what will the cost be to the village? Are there any unintended consequences that may occur if a policy is implemented and signs need to be changed? Could we get away with reducing the number of signs? I mean, these are very granular issues, but real. At the end of the day, somebody's going to have to pay for a policy change and how it's implemented. The communication of these changes. Nothing. The communication of the changes, how will that happen? Educating a community, specifically as it relates to parking, which touches everyone. Whether it's, if you don't have a car, you still may have guests that come. If you have a business, you have patrons, students, parents picking up children, dropping off children. I mean, it touches several people within the community. So we find that the most successful implementation is coupled with a pretty robust communication, information, PR program. And that can be done through video or through online, through public public television. There are several ways to go about that, but definitely needs to be part of it. The study area, just as a reminder, we're looking at the north to south, Whitefish to Milwaukee, and then east to west. Covers the village proper, and you can go to the next. And the core area, which we're referring to as the Central Business District, is Oakland, Capitol, Oakland North-South, Capitol East-West, approximately 1 block north-south, east-west of those roads. And just a few highlights on the information. There are 2,400 roughly on-street spaces, 2 publicly accessible garages, and it's different than, they're not publicly owned, but they can be accessed and used. And then 12 surface lots, And within those lots, there are 491 spaces. And, you know, the distribution is roughly 75% on-street supply, 25% off-street supply.
Is the on-street spaces just on Oakland and Capitol, or everything that's highlighted in this frame?
Everything highlighted.
Correct.
Yep.
Okay, so it goes off those two
Yeah.
main streets.
Yeah.
And even in a commercial area, that's a pretty low percentage of off-street supply. Shorewood obviously is majority on-street supply. That's on the lower side for a commercial district, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just something we noticed.
Yeah, it just reflects the density.
Right.
And you know, some communities choose to remove homes or remove businesses and put surface lots there. Others think surface lots are a temporary use until something with greater density can be built. It's a local planning philosophy that differs. You know, here we see, you know, even you look at Starbucks and how many spaces Starbucks has. Very few. And it encourages walkers, bikers, and other modes of transportation. And that can be part of the planning philosophy. The planning mission is to broaden the choices, the transportation choices, and the use of those choices. So, yeah, we see the ratio relatively high on the on-street, 75%, 25% off-street. And that, you know, leads into some of the frustrations that we hear in the comments where people say, what are our options for off-street parking? And we have this on-street supply that we don't all have access to it, you know, equally. So where do we go off-street? And you know, several of the lots have wait lists, so people are trying to comply. Just to review some of the goals, you know, the pulling from parking and transportation, which closely align. They're slightly different, but they're close. You know, we want to maximize communication to, you know, a good transportation network. Communication is paramount. Accessibility. We want to make sure in all recommendations that we're increasing access to the goods and services and the destinations. We're not reducing access. Standardization. When we walk through all the current ordinances and then we actually go into the market and we look at signage, we look at behavior, we look at what's out there right now as far as policy, there are ways to improve standardization and consistency, which ultimately it impacts compliance. When you do have a wide variance in ordinance and people are unsure and there's confusion, there's a risk for a higher rate of non-compliance. And ultimately, you know, the goal isn't to cite everybody with a citation, it's to get everybody to follow and work with this finite, you know, resource of parking and transportation in a way that maximizes the use for everybody. And then at the end, you know, we have safety. Make sure that, you know, recommendations that we put together are considering the safety concerns that have been expressed to us, whether it's pedestrians crossing the street or you know, on-street parking on roads that are too narrow, that maybe shouldn't accommodate both sides parking because it creates undue risk. Some people have also expressed a concern about parking in structured parking as a concern. You know, unfortunately, that's a great pool of supply, and it's intelligent design as far as building up with parking as opposed to distributing that over a large surface area. It's smart planning, but functionally, there's a perception there that limits the use at times by certain demographics.
And I'm guessing, I mean, you probably addressed this, but that is largely a perception versus reality situation.
Incident reports don't prove that out.
Right.
In the locations here. But all it takes is one. So statistically, you know, so statistically you could say, oh, you know, it's less than, out of all the people that park in there throughout the year, there's only been one or two or whatever it may be. Statistically, it's minor,
Yeah.
but it can throw, you know, shockwaves through the community and change behavior. So, and the reality is, walking through that garage in the evening, there isn't a high use in either facility that's open to the public for monthly permit use. And there's often safety in numbers that occurs. So the more facilities used, the safer people feel. When you only have 10, 15, 20 cars in a facility of 300 and you're, you know, going down the stairwell by yourself, that isolation can feed the perception of being an unsafe environment. So, rabbit trail, but moving back, we're gonna go into the next, this is a little small, but walking through, key preliminary recommendations. And, daytime parking time limits. Right now, we have 3, we have 2, we have 1. There are also 10-minute and 15-minute parking. We strongly feel standardizing the on-street time limits within the village would add clarity, still allow access and ensure access to the businesses, to the homes, to the
Where
land
parking
uses.
is currently time limited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was a little bit of a miscommunication this morning, but where it's currently time limited, where it's signed as such, we recommend standardization in the 2 hour, not the entire village as a whole, just where it's currently signed.
Cause we have, is it 2 and 3 hours that we've got?
It's largely 1 and 2 hour,
It's large,
One and
and
there's
then
30
10 and 15 minute.
Okay, so we don't really have anything over 2.
I don't believe so.
There's, yeah. We've documented all that within the previous, the map and the
Yeah.
slide, all the data, and how many ADA spaces exist. And obviously ADA would be exempt. However,
Do we have any ADA
uh-huh.
street spaces other than the one I know about on Oakland?
I
There-
think
there-
Diane
this-
this morning said there was 12.
Yeah,
Yeah, there are 2
Oh.
by the university, right by the campus,
Okay.
across the street.
I see one on Murray when I walk up in the morning. I know there's one on Murray.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Is
At
it-
the very end, it's, residents have
Yep.
requested they have it.
So Diane this morning
A
said there was
resident
12.
Mm.
And part of the conversation with that is some of them may be past their useful life, but we don't know that because we don't go back and review them annually.
Oh, yeah,
So,
right. Especially if it was a resident
It
who
was, yeah,
requested
like
it
that, yeah.
15 years ago
It's
and
been
now
there
they're moved or,
25 years
Right.
Yeah.
since then.
mhm.
interesting.
In some communities where there are more ADA spaces, they do an annual audit, or every 2 years, 3 years, they'll do an audit, just to make sure they're still required. So we would maintain the 2 hour where current parking for 2 hours exists, and then the areas where it varies, other than the 15-minute parking areas, we would adjust to bring consistency. There are some 10 by the school. There are also 15. Standardizing that, just keeping it simple. Daytime parking permits. Right now there are 6 districts. And speaking with the individuals that live within those districts, the district system works. The daytime parking, they're achieving the desired outcome. Maybe not on every block, because enforcement sometimes shifts the areas where the enforcement is being done. So they'll say that they need to call in and make sure they notify the police department or proper authorities to have somebody come out and check. And once they do that, compliance gets back in line. So the framework of the policy and of the program seems to be effective.
Is this for permits to park in 2 hour spots during the day? Is that,
That's daytime, correct,
okay,
as a resident.
because there's no permit required for daytime parking when there isn't restricted parking
Correct.
anywhere.
Where
that
there
I'm
isn't,
Yep.
yeah,
Okay.
it's only where.
it's largely by the university
Yeah, I
and
was gonna say it's
schools.
mostly on
Yeah,
that south end.
you have the RC, that's largely the southeast quadrant
Yeah.
of Shorewood. Correct, and then the other areas are small, they're essentially,
Block or two.
block or 2, mostly by the schools.
Mhm.
So there, you may have.
Oh, like by Atwater or?
Yeah,
Correct.
right, it's where the, yeah.
Okay, alright.
Yeah, Shorewood High
Across the street from the
School,
high school, across Capitol.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Alright.
and then by Metro Market behind to the west.
Okay.
And it's very evident what the purpose for those were. And so there's no need to make modifications, and we want to make sure that there's proper protocol in place if others request a district. There are procedures for that. How is it created? And one thing that our report doesn't expand on but will are policies and procedures. What are the protocols if a request is made for an ADA space, if a request is made for a district? What are those standards, those channels? Who's responsible? What department? So there'll be greater clarity within the document on those steps. So maintaining the daytime, overnight parking. Now this is the one that you really want people to think about. Let it marinate for a while. The providing overnight parking permits to residents through an overnight parking permit program. And now the definition of resident would include not only folks who live in a single family home, but also tenants within multi-unit housing. There are policies in place right now that limit from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. But the overnight parking permit program would be applicable and open to community members. So the change, where would it be directly impactful? Currently, landlords, management companies of apartments have access to a certain number of permits that they allocate to tenants as needed, as requested, as available. This would eliminate that step, and the tenants would go directly, that were seeking on-street would go directly to the village customer service and request, as opposed to